Hi, and welcome to episode 17 of CultureWatch Radio. I'm Andrew Smith, and with me is Bill Muhlenberg. We've had some good news this week from one Queensland Christian who dared to tell the truth about homosexuality. Bill?
Yes, quite good news indeed. We're referring to one Bernard Gaynor, a great man, husband, father, somebody with a fairly celebrated military career, but he's been daring to speak out for faith and family and freedom. So yeah, he's challenged the homosexual lobby and a lot of the immorality and public perversion that's on display there. And for daring to do so, he's actually gone through about 2 years of hell with homosexual activists dragging him to the courts. New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board had him up for something like almost 30 charges, brought by one serial pest litigant, a vexatious homosexual activist he just spends his life suing people, it seems. So after 2 years, having to spend over $50,000 to clear his name, a New South Wales VCAT kind of situation, civil and administrative tribunal, said, well, the complaints will be dismissed, mainly on a technicality, but nonetheless, those 30 or so complaints have been thrown out, and we now have a very relieved man and family up in Brisbane.
And it's not just the money aspects that are very dear and costly when it comes to doing court cases.
No, absolutely. As I mentioned, over $50,000 he's had to raise so far just on the court costs and defending himself, but obviously there's all the turmoil that he and his family had to go through, and, well, it's a general erosion of freedom, the idea that you have to be careful on what you say in public. That can take its toll. We're supposed to be a democracy. We're supposed to enjoy and celebrate freedom of speech in this country, but with the homosexual activists on the prowl, it's getting harder and harder just to speak your mind. So Bernard and his family have certainly gone through it, and this is a good, albeit perhaps temporary, win on his behalf.
So what you're saying, Bill, is he's not quite out of the woods yet.
Well, sadly not quite. As we say, these 30 or so charges have been dropped, or complaints. But I think since then there's been 11 new complaints raised to the Anti-Discrimination Board. And, of course, the laws themselves, the various anti-discrimination legislation, they're the cause of all this grief to begin with. So not only does Bernard have more specific complaints to deal with, and not only does this homosexual activist is likely to appeal that dismissal, the laws themselves still stand. So again, anything he says or does can once again become the object of litigation. In fact, even though this was a technicality because he was Queensland and the case was in New South Wales, that in itself can be risky. I, even as a Victorian, have been dragged up to the New South Wales courts based on something I've done in Victoria. So this whole area of, interstate litigation cases, the whole thing is a mess. And as Bernard would rightly say, we really need to deal with this legislation itself and get rid of some of this vexation law that's hampering freedom of speech.
Let's have a quick listen to what Bernard himself has had to say about this.
Well, I received 28 complaints under New South Wales anti-discrimination law from Gary Burns, a homosexual activist. The case has gone for about 18 months or a bit over that now. And finally, on Wednesday, we received news of our victory that there is no jurisdiction in Queensland with regards to New South Wales anti-discrimination law. And that's a very significant victory because it means a number of other complaints that Gary Burns has lodged will also now fail.
So what does that mean for you now?
Well, it means that for a start, I've got to wait 28 days to see whether this decision will be appealed. But it means that I'm no longer facing the threat of three $100,000 fines and the prospect of being ordered under the threat even of jail to apologise for my beliefs on homosexuality.
Well, it does seem like we are in a war. Bill, what can we do about this?
Well, as we said, this is not just an individual battle for one person, not just a specific set of laws, but really a much bigger part of the culture wars. It is a war on freedom of speech. It is a war on religious freedom, freedom of conscience. The activists, I hate to say it, are small and, a very teeny minority, but they're very vocal, they're very active, and they're getting the law on their side, as we say, with the various anti-discrimination laws, vilification laws, equal opportunity laws. All of these are aimed in many ways at Christians who dare to speak up. And two groups most using them, the homosexual activists and Muslims. In both cases, if you dare to say anything that's at all critical of the homosexual lifestyle or of the Islam and its very worrying aspects, in both cases, these sets of laws are being used to silence Christians. We've had famous cases here in Victoria of two pastors dragged up to the same kind of laws, found guilty, in fact, and then going through a big appeals process. So this is not a one-off case with Bernard Gaynor. There's many people being targeted, and so we have to deal with this kind of legislation. We need to put pressure on our MPs. The Liberal Party had said they were going to look at some of these laws and maybe tone them down, so that's still an ongoing process. And of course, it's a spiritual battle as well. We need to pray more than ever before. There are groups who do want to silence Christians. There's no mistake about that. So we have to be aware, we have to be engaged, we have to be prayerful, and we have to fight the fight on the various levels, including the legal and the political.
Bill, if same-sex marriage should be legalised, how many more triggers for discrimination against homosexuals would then become active?
Yes, very good question indeed. In fact, everything we've discussed up until now is taking place in a country where we don't have homosexual marriage, not yet. So if there's this much persecution of Christians, if there's this much anti-Christian bigotry already, well, just imagine if and when Australia goes down that path. And of course, all we have to do is look overseas to those countries who have legalized homosexual marriage to see what a can of worms this opens. One Christian group after another, one individual after another, being targeted by the homosexual militants, dragged to the courts, often losing their jobs, being heavily fined, sometimes thrown in jail. All this because when homosexual marriage becomes law, then they really have the platform with which to start going after and, in fact, persecuting actively Christians who refuse to go along with that agenda.
And it would seem it's just a matter of, my feelings are hurt.
Yes. Well, that is another great point. This is all about people who get offended. In a democracy where there's freedom of speech, I take it you get offended all the time. If somebody starts supporting Collingwood and I'm a Geelong fan, well, I'm going to get offended if this guy starts talking about his football team. But that's life, for heaven's sakes. That's how we live in a civil society. You point out different points of views. You put across competing visions and worldviews. And, in the past, we never took people to courts over being offended. But now we seem to have pulled out of a hat, the right not to be offended. Oh, you upset me with what you said. I'm going to take you to court and sue you. And that's exactly what we have here with the homosexual activists. They're claiming that they're offended. In fact, there's a famous lesbian couple in the States sued a Christian baker for not doing their cake. They were fined over $135,000 because the lesbian couple said, "Oh, we're offended. Our feelings were hurt." Imagine that. We are going down the tubes in a bad way. And so this litigious society we have is being exacerbated by the really militant homosexual lobby, which will not rest until all opposition is silenced.
Bill, brings to mind one of the proverbs that basically says, if you fall apart just because of something that you've heard or from offence, how much was there holding you together in the first place?
Yeah, well, quite right. There's a whole genre, there's a whole name for this. We talk about hate speech, right? If I say something critical of Islam or homosexuality, instead of that just being a point of view that should be debated and welcomed in a civil society, we now turn around and call it hate speech. And we even have whole hate speech laws on the books now, whole crimes based on supposed hate speech, which, as you say, has to do with offending somebody, making somebody feeling bad. In fact, we have vilification laws that have these very words. If you cause humiliation or insult or injury or make somebody feel bad, I mean, that's how bad these laws are, where you're afraid to simply open your mouth. And if you do, well, as poor Bernard has found, you can get dragged through the mud for a full 2 years, and then some on top of that. So this is a scary place to be in, and all the more reason to remain vigilant.
And as always, more information and resources are available at the Culture Watch website. And we'll see you again next week with another episode of Culture Watch Radio.